So I'm writing here because I have no idea where else to share this. Who else could I even share this with? What I'm about to tell you is going to sound super cliche, I know, but I promise you it's not what you think. I guess I'll just start from the beginning. A while ago, my little brother Tyler got his hands on a copy of that new Pokemon game, Scarlet or something. Sorry, I'm not really into video games myself. He had been whining about wanting a copy since all of his friends already had the game, but his birthday's coming up at the end of the month, so we were all planning on getting it for him then. But the other day, he comes home from school, happy as a clam, with a new game card popped into his Switch. Now, our mom immediately grilled him on where he got it from. He insisted that he only was borrowing it. He said his friend Tony had lent it to him, so of course, first thing Mom does is call up Tony's folks and make sure that this is true. At first, she's pretty irritated because she had just bought the game for him the other day, but oddly enough, when she went to confront him about it, Tony was sitting in his room playing the game. It couldn't have been his after all. This was confusing to all of us, so my mom asked him about it, and when pressed, Tony said that he had borrowed it from another friend at school at the beginning of the week, but the game had started acting funny, and then he got his own copy. So, seeing that Tyler didn't have the game, he then lent it on to him. He said he could just return it when he was done in his place. He then asked what he meant by the game was acting funny, and he sort of shrugged it off. He said that the game was released with a load of bugs in it. Glitches were common. He then asked who he had borrowed the game from and said, Aiden. Of course, nothing can be easy, so Tony didn't remember his last name. So we decided the best thing to do was to email the school and tell them that we had the game and were trying to find who owned it and to make sure that it really was okay to borrow. In the meantime, however, Tyler begged and begged to still be allowed to play. My mom supposed it should be all right, but told him that as soon as we found the owner, he'd have to return the game. Tyler excitedly agreed, and that was that. Well, a few days passed and nothing seemed terribly amiss. This is except Tyler kept babbling about some weird glitch that he kept getting. When asked about it, he said that a random character with the same name as his would sometimes appear and say nonsense text before disappearing. It would make his game crash, which annoyed him, but otherwise didn't bother him too much. That is, at least until it started happening more frequently. Tyler started getting so annoyed that he stopped playing the game for a little while. At this point, I was growing curious about the glitch, so when Tyler discarded his Switch to go play outside, I snatched it up. When I started up the game, bright colors and rendered sceneries met my eyes. It took me a moment to figure out how the controls worked, but eventually I managed to start running around. It was pretty cute. It actually made me contemplate genuinely giving it a try myself. But over the course of me trying it out, nothing odd happened. Eventually, I got tired of it and set the console down on my bedside table. The rest of the evening passed and nothing of note happened. Before I knew it, I was in bed for the night. I was just on the brink of sleep when suddenly a shrill, electronic noise rang out through the room. I immediately sat up and looked around the room. I had forgotten I'd left the Switch on my bedside table, and somehow it had come out of sleep mode. The screeching noise it had previously made had stopped as it silently sat on the home screen, waiting to be unlocked. Having no idea what had caused the noise, I picked it up and unlocked it. The game seemed normal enough, and I squinted my eyes at the bright light in the dark room. Shrugging it off, I hit the power button again and set it back down. Again, I lied back down and tried to go back to bed. And again, the silence was broken by that weird electronic shrieking sound. And what's worse, the lights in my room suddenly flickered before going dark again. At this point, you could say I was sufficiently creeped out. At this point, I became acutely aware of the unsettling feeling of being watched. I scanned my room for any signs of danger, but there was nothing there. No one else had been woken up by the weird noise and lights, and the house was quiet. Again, my room was dimly lit by the screen of the Switch powering on again, so I grabbed it to see what the hell was going on. The lock screen was visible, but it was acting kind of strangely. It seemed to jitter and flicker in ways I'd never seen it behave before. Hoping my brother's system hadn't somehow broken, I decided to unlock it and make sure nothing was amiss. So I mashed the buttons on the home screen and waited. Once again, the bright, colorful world greeted me, but something else was off. It wasn't where I recall leaving my character. I was standing up on top of a very steep cliff. Suddenly, my character moved without my input and leapt from the cliff. I was horrified until right before hitting the ground below, the character bounced upright, clinging to some kind of cell phone device. I sighed with relief, then looked around where my character had fallen. It was some kind of dense forest. It looked really out of place with the rest of the map. They seemed to be in a completely different style than the rest of the game. It looked almost far more realistic. Suddenly, the screen was filled with a different character. The soundtrack began oddly skipping and occasionally creating that awful screeching. The little name plaque above the character read, Aiden. Now, this character looked differently from all the others in the game that I had seen. It was in the same style, but something was off. His eyes seemed dull and lifeless, a little more sunken into his head. Its proportions were also ever slightly more realistic than the other highly stylized models. Nothing was inherently grotesque about it, that is. I guess the best way to put it was that it kind of fell into the uncanny valley. This Aiden character stared dully at me before a dialogue box popped up. Just as Tyler had described, it was a bunch of nonsense, just numbers scrolling past the screen. They repeated again and again, and no matter how many times I pressed any button, I couldn't close out of it, so I hit the power button again. I sat quietly in my room, in the dark, listening to the pounding of my heart. The hell was happening? I barely had time to process before the silence was broken by the screeching again. The switch had turned on again and unlocked itself. Again, that uncanny valley character stared back at me, closer to the camera this time. It spammed the same string of numbers again and again. The oddly skipping and screeching soundtrack seemed to grow louder, and it was really starting to freak me out. I hit the power button, but this time nothing happened. The numbers repeated again and again, and I mashed the power button again and again until finally the screen went black. But when I stared into the black reflective surface, a pair of eyes that weren't my own stared back. This time the eyes looked real. Still, they were wrong. The eyes were sunken, dull, and lifeless. They filled me with as much pity as they did fear. One last time the screen lit up. This time they repeated the numbers a single time. My heart raced, but I leaned in closer to give them a proper look. These weren't numbers, they were coordinates. My heart raced. And I pulled up a search engine on my phone. I plugged in the numbers and went to a satellite view of the map. I don't know what compelled me at this point. I mean, yeah, I know it was incredibly foolish, but all I can say in my defense is that those eyes that stared back at me were so pitifully reminded me so much of little Tyler that I couldn't stop myself. I snuck down the hallway as fast as I could and I snagged the keys. Fortunately, I just gotten my license this year, so I quickly hopped into the family sedan and I took off as quickly as I could. And by some miracle, my phone didn't blow up, so I guess I got out unnoticed. The coordinates were about an hour away. But it was only about 11 p.m., so I had plenty of time to get back before morning. Eventually, the road took me far outside of our town and started elevating into the mountains that sat just outside of the city limits. The road twisted and turned, and it was incredibly unpleasant to drive on. As I grew closer and closer to the coordinates, I noticed a lot of loose dirt and rubble near the road. Suddenly I had come to a stop. Huge chunks of earth scattered across the road, partially obscured deep tire marks. Just ahead of that was a guardrail that had been busted clean off. I got a really bad feeling in my gut as I pulled over to the side of the road. With shaky legs, I got out of the car and walked up to the edge. My heart leapt into my throat when I saw the smashed-up shell of an SUV down below. A few hours later, the place was crawling with a rescue team. I got severely scolded for running off with the car, but my grounding sentence was softened, all things considered. See, when the search and rescue got down to the car, they realized it was a family that had gone missing. And sadly, none of them made it. It was a husband and wife, and their little boy, Aiden. They had been on their way to go geocaching when a landslide suddenly knocked them off the road. Their surviving family eventually got a hold of us and wanted to thank us for finding them. They said Tyler could keep the game. Aiden would have wanted it. This whole thing was such an odd experience. I'm honestly not sure how to process it all. The glitch never happened again. There's been no weirdness since. I sometimes wonder if I imagine the whole thing, but then I remember those coordinates flashing across the screen. Whatever the case, I hope that little Aiden can rest in peace now. Fall is finally here, and it's finally cooling down, which means it's time for you guys to get yourself a hot cup of tea. My wife happens to sell tea. Etsy.com/shop/Ivory Monocle Tea sells different teas that are inspired by nerdy-based things, as well as a bunch of new teas that are available for the Halloween season. My personal favorite, the one that I drink whenever I'm recording, is Dark and Stormy Night. It has a little MrCreepyPasta symbol on it, and if you ask, you can get a little MrCreepyPasta dabbing sticker. Also, anytime that you order one of those, you actually get my autograph on a little card, so if you want that, hey, you can get that. And finally, I want to give a huge thank you to everybody who supports me on Patreon. So I want to give a very special thank you to Jordan Humble, Diana Kraus, Disciple, Strategy Wolf Emoji, SullyMan, Brandon Mendoza, BrimstonePandemonium, Caltuna, William Wellington, Scruffy the Janitor, Brenna LaQueda Canizales, Smiley the Psychotic, Jjenna, Dante Kinkade, SimbasBloodyMojo, Mephistopheles, CursepoxPrimarch, M, Jesus Cornejo, Yarghoul, VerbalHorror, Amber Clark, J. Kearns, Mike, himbojerry, CrusaderChocobo, Corbin Dallas, Estebean, Seclude, Salty Surprise, Red Shadowcat, Turtleman, Cryolinian, Mr. Marcus Blitz, Dirt Diver 030, Voice of Sand, Psychomel, Melted Lake, Tali Sue, William King, Sashi Suzaku, Croconut 509, Stricken, Freddy Krueger, Hades Nephew, Acid System, Sky Harbor, Nico Kyle, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, Daniel Polson, and Corey Kenshin. I really appreciate your support, and I cannot thank you enough. I wish you all the best. Sweet dreams.